policymakers, members of the press, ladies and gentlemen. We are launching today, as part of a long tradition, the Global Human Development Report. This is a regional launch, but with a slight difference. As you know, the Human Development Report is a report prepared by UNDP in New York annually, identifying a set of themes. This year, this launch will be in partnership with the newly launched International Center for Human Development and UNDP. The International Center for Human Development is an initiative of the Government of India and UNDP to create an institutional space for the global community to explore ideas and issues of human development. If we look at the 22 human development reports that have been published to date, including this year's report, what you will see is a very elaborate and conceptual landscape that is emerging for policymakers and scholars to explore important thematics.
The report?
To explore important thematics that, in a sense, to understand the complex transformations that are taking place in countries across the world, and most interestingly, in countries of the global south. You would see themes that range from financing human development to cultural liberty in today's diverse world, to issues like beyond scarcity, power, poverty, and the global water crisis, to today's the rise of the global south. In this landscape, you will see a framework for analysis emerging. You will see a comparative picture. You will see a vast and very rich body of data available for interpretation. I'm delighted to invite Ms. Lisa Gran, the regional representative of the UN in India, and also the resident representative of UNDP, to welcome all of us and give us a brief preview on the Human Development Report.
Peter, thank you. Honorable Deputy Chairman, Dr. Agarwal, Dr. Soban, our good friend Dr. Ajay Cheeber, and Dr. D'Souza, allow us to pay our respects to the members of the panel and to welcome everyone today to this important event. On behalf of the United Nations Development Program and the newly established International Center for Human Development, it's our great pleasure to have you all with us for the Asia-Pacific regional launch of UNDP's flagship Global Development Report for 2013. As Peter was saying, UNDP published its first Human Development Report in 1990. Since then, 22 global reports have been launched, 32 regional human development reports have been published, and 670 national and subnational reports have been launched around the world. India, of all the countries in the world, has the most impressive track record with human development reports. In India alone, more than 80 reports have been published, a higher number than any other country. As Peter said, this year's Global Human Development Report focuses on the rise of the Global South. It examines the profound shift in global dynamics that is being driven by the fast-rising new powers in the world, including, most importantly, India and China. And the report argues that many developing countries, including Turkey, Mexico, Thailand, Brazil, and South Africa, are becoming leading actors on the world stage and have seen tremendous growth, in large part because of continuing investments in human development. The report also documents the highly innovative social and economic policies that are originating from the emerging powers, including conditional and direct cash transfer programs and new business models that are focused on low-income customers. The report also underlines the fact that many emerging powers are major trade, investment, and increasingly development partners for other developing countries. The report builds on insights by world leaders about the impact of South-South cooperation. And if you allow me to directly quote the United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who in a recent major speech said, "South-South cooperation has the potential to balance growth and equity on a global scale. Even in the midst of severe economic, social, and political instabilities around the world, South-South cooperation has continued to drive buoyant trade and financial flows." We're honored today to have with us as part of our panel Dr. Ajay Cheeber, the Regional Director for UNDP's Bureau of Asia and the Pacific. Dr. Cheeber will be presenting the key recommendations contained in the report. We are particularly honored that Mr. Montek Ahluwalia, the Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, will give our special address, and that Professor Raymond Soban and Professor Beena Agarwal will be sharing their views on the key ideas discussed in the report. This is the second major event of the newly established International Center for Human Development, as Peter said, a joint initiative of the Government of India, UNDP, and the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies. The aim of the International Center is to provide a multi-stakeholder platform for discussions on South-South cooperation on human development action and to facilitate the translation of development policy and theory into practices that make sense on the ground. On behalf of UNDP and the International Center for Human Development, we wish to thank you for joining us at this regional launch event. What we would like to do now is to officially open the document, and we will ask the members of the podium if they would kindly rise. We have copies of the report.
Okay. Good.
Thank you very much for that. And Dr. Cheeber, may we invite you to the podium for your presentation.
Honorable Deputy Chairman Montek Ahluwalia, Dr. Rahman Saban, Dr. Beena Agarwal, Mr. D'Souza, please. Welcome to all the guests, ambassadors, diplomats, ladies, gentlemen from the press. I also understand there's a delegation of press people from around the world who are visiting India, and they are here to join us. I'm so happy, and good morning to all of you. I'm not the author of this report, but I'll do my best at presenting it to you. It's a topic that I do feel very passionate about, and so I commend this report to you as well. Fortunately, I have here also the chief statistician of the Human Development Report Office, Milorad Kovacevic. He's here. So all the difficult questions on the data issues he will address, and I'll take all the easy questions at some point. This 2013 Human Development Report, titled "The Rise of the South: Human Progress in a Diverse World," really examines what we consider tectonic shifts that are taking place in the global development landscape. This report really looks at how and why so many developing nations of the South are now rising with unprecedented speed and scale, and how, in a way, these successes can enhance human development progress in all parts of the world for decades to come. The rise of the South, no, one before. The rise of the South is not just about a few countries. Rather, it's how so many developing countries have really surged forward in this short period of time in human development. More than 40 of these countries are identified in the report as especially high achievers with human development progress. Of these, 18 are analyzed in some considerable depth as the policy drivers in the rise of the South. Just leave it there. Yeah. As you can see on the slide here, the sheer scale and speed of human development in terms of the number of people that are being affected by these changes is really a phenomena without historic precedent. This is really a new world. In Britain, when the Industrial Revolution started, the population of less than 10 million people, it took 150 years to double output per person. In the United States, which industrialized later, it took 50 years with a population of about 30 million. In contrast, the current takeoff in China and India with over 1 billion people each alone, with output per person doubling in about 20 years. Take a look at China, India, and Brazil together on this chart in a great global rebalancing of power and wealth. These three leading economies of the developing world will soon surpass the combined GDP in PPP terms of the 6 traditional powers of Western Europe and North America. Next. Global rebalancing has also been accompanied by an unprecedented linking of the developing world, of the South. Between 1980 and 2011, South-South trade as a share of world merchandise trade rose from 8.1% to 26.7%, with growth particularly remarkable in the 2000 decade. Over the same period, the share of north-to-north trade declined from less than 30%. These trends actually hold true even when exports and imports of natural resources are excluded. South-South trade has therefore been a very important stimulus of growth, even during the recent economic downturn. Countries of the South are exporting more merchandise and manufactures to each other than to the countries of the North, and those exports are more intensive in skills and technology. Next. The story of the rise of the South is not just about Brazil or China or India. It's about more than 40 countries shown here, and in particularly 18 that we have examined more closely in this chart. Between 1990 and 2012, 130 out of 132 countries in our sample improved their ranking on the Human Development Index. The pace of progress was particularly rapid in more than 40 countries, where improvements in HDI between 1990 and 2010 were far better than would have been predicted for countries that were at similar levels of the Human Development Index in 1990. The report's diverse set of 18 achievers, big and small, from all regions of the world, Ghana and Uganda in sub-Saharan Africa, Bangladesh and India in South Asia, Tunisia from the Arab states, China, Indonesia, and in Vietnam in East Asia, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico in Latin America, just to name a few. This means that a very large population in the South not only has increased its income, but is also better educated and in better health than ever before. Next. The HDI in 2012 reveals much progress. Over the past decade, countries across the world have been converging towards higher levels of human development. The interesting point is that the pace of progress on the HDI has been fastest in countries in the low and medium human development categories. This is good news. This is convergence. Yet progress, of course, requires more than average improvements in HDI value. If it will be neither desirable nor sustainable, of course, if the increases in HDI value are accompanied by rising inequality in income, unsustainable patterns of consumption, high military spending, and low social cohesion. An interesting story is the rise of the massive expansion of the middle class in these countries. As standards of living have risen worldwide, the middle class has exploded in size and is becoming truly global. And the middle class in terms of education, health standards, expectations of government and public services, and interaction with the outside world through both internet and personal connections. If you look at the Asia-Pacific region alone, where we are, by 2020, to about half of the world's middle class. And by 2030, it will have more than 2/3 of the world's middle class population. Next. The report argues that increasing connectivity has both economic and political implications. For example, citizens in Africa are taking advantage of affordable Asian-built mobile phones to operate cellular banking, which is both cheaper and easier than traditional banking. On the political level, the Arab Spring demonstrated how ideas can spread, how new technologies can be used to mobilize action. But beyond this, we are seeing a growing global civil society network advocating for different development issues, from climate change to affordable medicine. Now, of course, the question is, why have these countries done so much better than others and so much better than ever before? How have so many countries in the South transformed their human development? Given their enormous social and political diversity, their contrasting natural resource endowments, their trajectories have often diverged. Yet there are some underlying themes that come out when you look at, particularly at these 18 countries in some depth, the very 18 successful countries. They seem to have had three common drivers that the report highlights. First is their proactive developmental states. They have all had a very proactive developmental state. Second is their capacity to tap into global markets. And third, their very heavy focus on social policies and social policy innovation. Many countries have made substantial progress over the past 2 decades. The rise of the South has been fairly broad-based. But yet you see that these high achievers have not only boosted their national income, but also have better than average performance on social indicators in health and education. Next. So let's look at the first common characteristic, which is the proactive developmental state. What explained the pace of this improvement is that these transformational experiences have been shaped by very strong, proactive, and responsible states that have succeeded in implementing policies for their public and private sectors and have charted a balanced approach to development. It's not been a story of getting the prices right, it's more been a story of getting the policies right. They haven't followed, most of these successful states haven't really followed a single model. Instead, faced with different challenges, they have needed to adapt to their specific situations in a very pragmatic way. The Republic of Korea, for example, shifted from import substitution to export promotion, as did some others. Chile, for example, subsidized research partnerships between private firms and universities. Rwanda boosted jobs in tourism and put a premium on educating girls. Brazil built a world-class aviation industry. These are just examples of the drivers that have allowed several countries in the South to turn industries into early drivers of success. The second common feature to these is the tapping, next, global markets. is that countries have chosen to engage, often on their own terms, with global markets. China, for example, reformed through a gradual and sequenced integration with the world. Bangladesh, Professor Soban may talk more about it later, has focused on textiles, using key relationships with customers in Korea. Ghana has diversified from cocoa into services, in particular telecom. The South in 2011 accounted for nearly half of world exports and imports of merchandise goods, up from about a quarter in 1980-81. The increase in the South's share of world's trade in goods has largely been driven by the tripling of South-South trade, from under 8% of total world trade in 1980 to over 25% in 2011. South-South interactions have prompted companies to create products and processes that are much better suited to local needs. African farmers, as I mentioned, use cheap mobile phones from India and China to check grain prices, for example. And the third next big driver that seems to be common to all these has been the success in their social policies. Few countries have sustained rapid growth without substantial levels of public investment, not just in infrastructure, but also in social policy, particularly in health and education. Putting into practice innovative social policies has been a very strong driver of success of these countries. Examples include progressive conditional cash transfer schemes, increasing access to high-quality education, and healthcare. In Latin America, for example, Brazil and Mexico created cash transfer programs to boost welfare. Ghana and Indonesia invested in higher quality education systems. Mexico and Rwanda have boosted their healthcare. Brazil, India, and China have built broad-based systems to boost social cohesion through development. And the interesting thing that the report points out, there's a nice box by Mayor Bloomberg of New York City, is that when he, the mayor, Mayor Bloomberg, wanted ideas for an anti-poverty program for New York, he visited Mexico to see how the conditional cash transfer programs were being done there. And I'm told he's also taken the idea of microcredit from Bangladesh. In India, for example, the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme provides up to 100 days of unskilled manual labor to eligible rural poor at the statutory minimum wage. This is a very interesting, innovative social idea, because it promises access to income and some insurance for the poor against the vagaries of seasonal work, and affords individuals the self-respect and empowerment associated with this work. Next. So then the question becomes, how do we, as we look forward into even more challenges in the world, how do we make sure that the pace of progress that we have seen over the last decade and a half can be sustained? What are the challenges that we are likely to see? Next. Sorry, the next one. Well, first, I think the big challenge, of course, is rising inequality. And so reducing inequality and redressing inequities in opportunities is one of the most important challenges, development challenges, that not just the South, I think this is a challenge even in the North, that the world faces. The report notes that the countries that starts with lower levels of inequality tend to do better and improve more in human development. Inequality is very destabilizing, both socially and politically. It limits the people's ability to find better jobs and inhibits them from engaging in public debate and making important demands on government for healthcare, social security, and other entitlements. One of the most important instruments of human development that the report points, of course, is reducing gender inequality through education. Educating girls through adulthood is perhaps the single most effective route to positive social change. because educated women tend to have fewer, healthier, and better educated children with all the developmental advantages for success. The second big driver for the countries of South is enabling greater voice and participation. Unless people can participate meaningfully in the events and processes that shape their lives, national human development will neither be desirable nor sustainable. So, people should really have a much greater say, as the report points out, in influencing policy making and its results. Now, of course, there has to be a balanced approach. And as one of the interesting slides in the report is this slide that depicts the problem of the Arab Spring very well. Of the 20 countries with the largest increase in mean-year schooling between 1980 and 2010, 8 were from the Arab states. So there was a very heavy emphasis in the Arab world on education. But because jobs failed to keep pace with educational attainment, this excluded a very large part of the population, especially the young, educated young, from participating in the economic, social, and political affairs of their countries. This disconnect helped fuel the civil uprisings that began in the spring of 2011. So it's not just a question of just providing more education, but if there are no jobs for all these educated people, then this will lead to the kind of social explosion that we've seen in the Arab world. And this, I think, is a challenge for countries in Asia Pacific as well, because we are now investing a lot more in education, but we have to be equally sure that when these educated people come out of our secondary schools and tertiary institutions, then the jobs are also available. Next. And the next big challenge that we face, of course, is the environmental challenge. That if you look at the chart that the report has, there's a very strong positive correlation between the Human Development Index and your environmental footprint on this planet. So we haven't yet discovered a way to increase the Human Development Index without imposing a very big human footprint on on planet Earth. The plot of the ecological footprint that you see of consumption of 151 countries against their HDI value reveals that very few countries have had a high HDI value and an ecological footprint below the world's average biocapacity. This does not bode well for us. This means that over time, as countries try to improve their Human Development Index, they will be imposing a greater and greater pressure on the resources of the Earth. Next. Now, just to illustrate what the report has done is look particularly at two parts of the world where a kind of an environmental disaster scenario could be very, very detrimental to Human Development Index progress. This is Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. As you can see in the chart, this is potentially a huge issue for us. It's not an issue that can be neglected. And I know here in India, Deputy Chairman Montek Ahluwalia, the Rural Minister, and the Environment Minister have come together on a strategy for greening rural development already. So, but this is a very big challenge that I think the world faces, and certainly countries like India and others in South Asia particularly face next. Now, the other big issue, of course, is demography destiny? And is the dependency ratio is how many citizens really depend on others for support because of their age. And this particularly is highlighted by what's happening in China, is illustrated in this report. In the next few decades, the working age population in many developing countries, particularly in China, will support a very significantly larger aging population. And it's very critical how these countries prepare themselves for these challenges. There are some suggestions, of course, in the report. So you have a double challenge. You have an explosive population in some countries, very young population of the kind we saw in that chart on the Arab Spring. But you also have a very different problem, particularly in some parts of Asia, where there's a very rapidly aging population as well at the same time. And both. You have states in India, like in Kerala, where you probably have more of the Chinese type of situation, where very significantly aging population. And then there would be other states in India where you have the opposite situation of a very big demographic bulge playing itself out with all the issues related to education and job creation that I mentioned. Next. Now, of course, in a global world, you ask if there are these huge tectonic shifts taking place in the economics, what are the corresponding changes that you would expect to see in the way the world is governed, in the institutions of governance around the world? And as the report points out, there hasn't been enough change in the way that the world is being governed. Next. So we have to start thinking, and people in the North have to start thinking, that the global governance institutions today are very much those that were put in place right after the Second World War. And in the meantime, and particularly in the last 2 decades, you have seen these huge, huge changes in the economic landscape of the world. And the question, of course, comes, how do we then address this? Next. Sorry, just the one before that. Yeah. No, this is good. Next one, please. Yeah, sorry. So, of course, there are the new emerging powers in the world, particularly the G20 developing countries, Brazil, China, and India, but even other, and Turkey, but even others like Thailand and the Gulf countries are now, of course, making very substantial transfers of money, expertise, technology to less developed countries. For example, between 2001 and 2008, countries and institutions from the South met 47% of official infrastructure financing for sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, one of the big numbers that you see in the South, its rising economic clout, is coming through its massive accumulation of foreign currency reserves. In 2011, the South held nearly 70% of $10 trillion in global reserves. Allocating just 3% of liquid reserves of the 9 G20 countries in the South would substantially increase the amount for public investment in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia to nearly 12% of GDP. So it's the potential now for countries from the South to help countries in the South has changed very much. You don't only have to depend on the existing institutions dominated by the North. So, what this report says, of course, is that the rising economic strength must be supported, must be very supportive of human development of the South. The report's findings have the following implications. It's critical to continue to match rising economic strength with growth in human development by making ever more policy commitments to health, education, equity, gender, environment, and social problems. Secondly, the less developed countries can learn and benefit from the success of emerging economies in the South. Thirdly, we need much greater representation for the South on major global challenges. The rise of the South presents, the report says, very big new opportunities for changing the way we think about public goods, clean air, stable climate, global commons. The report also points to, of course, the report was written a few months ago. In a way, the announcement that was made recently at the BRICS summit of the new BRICS Development Bank was kind of recommended as well in the HDR itself. So beaten to the gun, as it were, by the announcement. But I think it's a very, very positive and challenging announcement. The facility that was also announced, currency facility, as I mentioned, the reserves are high, but one way is to use them in a way to help stabilize each other. That was also a very healthy announcement. Of course, all this means that it's chipping away bit by bit at the institutional arrangements. But we believe something more dramatic, more bold is needed. A new South Commission perhaps is an idea that the report recommends, that a place from where more and more ideas about South-South interactions can be undertaken. The South Commission, as you know, was established first under President Nyerere, and then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh led it very effectively for a long time. But lately it has kind of somewhat disappeared from the scene. So what the report recommends is a new revamped South Commission that would take up these ideas and challenges as we go forward. Of course, the political institutions of the world, the Security Council, have to be revamped, and this is, again, a very important shift that will take place. If the institutions will not be changed, then the countries of the South will probably look for alternative ways in which to exercise their leverage, as was the case with the BRICS Development Bank. But in any case, the report makes a very, very strong plea to the world that the time has come for a major institutional restructuring of the global institutions in order to be able to benefit better to address the challenges that the globe faces, whether they are environmental challenges, whether they're challenges of social cohesion, whether they're challenges of nuclear disarmament and war and peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chibber, for this fascinating overview and for the insights and findings of the report, which add up to a picture of the rise of the South. We are running short of time, so may I straight away invite Mr. Montek Ahluwalia to give us the special address.
I'm going to do it after.
Would you like to?
Yeah, I think it might be better.
May I now invite Dr. Rehman Soban, Chairman, Center for Policy Dialogue, Bangladesh, and one of the key intellectual and policy figures in South Asia and in the global South, to make the address. He has been, in his working career, Professor of Economics at Dhaka University. He has been a member of the Commission of Planning in Bangladesh. He has set up several institutions, and most recently this Center for Policy Dialogue in Bangladesh. Professor Soban.
Thank you. Speak from here. Yeah. I had hoped to follow Montek. This would always be advantageous to react to him rather than to get him to react to us. However, to begin with, let me, of course, congratulate the UN system for the launch of HDR 2013. I was there at the creation when my Cambridge contemporary Mehboob Haq, in fact, initiated this process and, of course, made a very significant contribution to the development discourse by, in fact, focusing attention on the importance of human development and the relevance of measuring this in relation to conventional measures of GDP growth. However, the world has moved on. This is 2013. 2 decades have gone by. And we now have to address human development in the new contexts which have emerged. Part of this has been addressed in this report in the context of the rise of the South. The second addresses the issue of advancing human development in the new generation, which would basically be what you may call the post-MDG era, which will be coming to its close on 2015. So what should be the agenda items which should be put on the table? The report attempts to, in fact, address some of these issues. It attempts to, of course, link the rise of the South with the issues of advancing human development. I'm not sure that the conceptual relationship has been that clearly brought out over here, because obviously whilst the transformation of the South as a collective entity is very significant in the world order, within the South there are huge disparities which need to be recognized. And within the South itself, the individual countries who have made significant advances, there are significant inequities which have actually emerged. There's an interesting table in the HDR which in fact looks at the HDI and then the inequality adjusted HDI. And it comes up with some interesting numbers that in fact whilst the adjustment downwards was only 0.99 for Europe and Central Asia, which includes actually the ex-Soviet republics, which in fact have very low adjustments to make. But South Asia's adjusted index was 126. Latin America, which had relatively high HDI indicators, was 199. East Asia was 126 or 0.126. South Asia was 0.163. And Sub-Saharan Africa was 0.166. And then within the BRICS themselves, the most dynamic elements of the South, the numbers which were provided were Brazil, 0.199, in spite of Bolsa Familia and all the other interventions which have been made. India was 0.162. China, for being the most dynamic growing country in the South, was still 0.16, so that in these countries themselves, there have been significant enhancements in both income inequality and social disparity. So, given these potential tensions between these two elements of the HDR, what I will essentially try to do is to address these components autonomously in the very short time which is available to me, and essentially address the issue of how far the disparities which have emerged within the South, in spite of the very significant advances which can be made, can be in fact narrowed through strengthening of South-South integration, and how far whatever significant gains have been made in human development can now open up a new agenda for, in fact, narrowing inequalities and promoting a more inclusive development process. Now, if you look at the rise of the South, which has been significantly and brought out in this report, and it presents very interesting information, we have seen that a lot of this growth is driven by the so-called BRICS. I, in fact, would expand this to BRICS Plus, because it would bring in countries like Turkey and other drivers within the South, which have managed to register very significant growth. However, the relevant issue, I think, which should be concerning all of us, is the critical ways in which the growth of the BRICS, which has a transformatory impact on the global system, can in fact leverage growth in the rest of the South and take other countries, particularly the LDCs, along with it. Because we have actually two Souths in the way of the BRICS on the one side and the LDCs on the other. And here I will very quickly zero in on two of the elements of the BRICS. One is China and the other is India. Now, interestingly enough, China has been very successful in leveraging growth in other countries around it, particularly in the neighborhood of East and Southeast Asia. And in fact, Chinese growth has buoyed growth. In fact, the response of Southeast Asia to the global recession was significantly alleviated by the rapid and continuing growth of China during this period. And part of it is structurally related, because Chinese growth created structural space, both for enhanced commodity exports from within the South, within its neighbors, within sub-Saharan Africa, and indeed within India. In fact, China has emerged as India's largest trading partner, largely through commodity-driven exports to China. And similarly, within its neighboring areas, China has created space by constructing supply chains, where in fact its neighbors have in fact actually been feeding the value added in China, which has been promoting its explosive export growth. India, unfortunately, has not played such a catalytic role in its neighborhood. And part of this is structural, part of it is the essentially closed and defensive nature of the Indian system. So that in fact, whilst India has emerged as a very large source of exports to its neighbors, it has not been a corresponding market for its smaller neighbors, so that its growth, as it has grown, it has significantly leveraged imports from within the region. Sri Lanka has a free trade agreement with India, and it has had a very useful impact on stimulating growth in exports, but nowhere near what you would see has been leveraged by China from neighboring countries like Laos and Cambodia and Indonesia and Thailand. Similarly, you've had free trade area with Nepal, but I don't think that your growth has leveraged or boosted growth. The one significant growth has been illegal, or in some cases legal, sort of migration into India, which is of course always to be welcomed, and we would hope would be legitimized as a form of service exports in response to Indian growth. However, India needs to in fact significantly open up its markets. It was in this very area, in this very institution in 1985, we are talking about Prachin Kal mein, when I addressed South Asia gathering, which was presided over by Mr. Narasimham Rao as foreign minister, so you can know how ancient this is. We were making the demand that India would in fact actually open up its markets and create a free trade space for its neighbors and to correspondingly stimulate the economy. It's moved very slowly. In Bangladesh, it's finally got NTB-free access to the Indian market, but it's a long time coming, and it has to be leveraged by significant interventions of resource flows and stimulation of investment. Now, at the global level, of course, you need to see how the new developments can be used to leverage this transformation. Obviously, now the South has become a global space for accumulating investable surpluses. I lived through with people like Muchkund Dubey in the area of the new international economic order, when we were attempting to leverage the surpluses accumulated by the oil exporting countries as a resource for stimulating the growth of the South. That did not come to much for a variety of reasons. But today there is a new process of structural change where the growth of the South is not driven by commodity exports, but is driven by greater competitiveness of the southern countries, or particular southern countries, so that this is going to be a long-term process. And the consequences of this have been a significant accumulation of reserves, which have been pointed out in the presentation by Ajay Chibar, and of course the rise of the sovereign wealth funds. So that today you have the paradoxical situation where the South, and particularly the Asian South, including West Asia and East Asia, are underwriting the twin deficits of the US economy, both on the budget and the balance of payments account. And the US has become a sinkhole for, in fact, global capital transfers to underwrite their macroeconomic and political incompetencies in dealing with the structural maladjustments of the economy. Now, obviously, a very significant transformation could take place if what we regard professionally as the very inefficient utilization of the surpluses of the South in underwriting the economy of the United States could even be marginally relocated to the underwriting of infrastructure development and the initiation of processes of structural change within the economy, so that you would graduate from commodity exporting economies into value-added exports around the region. And whether you create a special development fund as in the BRICS Bank or other relevant institutions, the relocation within the South of using resources which are at their command, and particularly the rediversion of the sovereign wealth funds, would in fact be a major development in this particular process. Now, let me quickly move on to the issue of advancing human development. And here, of course, the critical issue is the issue of addressing equity and promoting a new inclusive agenda. The Human Development Agenda has, of course, emphasized this and has highlighted the issue in the discussions relating to the new agenda post-MDG. However, they still continue to address symptoms. I was attracted by a recent citing of an Urdu couplet addressing this peculiar distortion in policy agendas. It says, Umar bhar ek hi galti rahi, धूल थी चेहरे पर, हम ऐने साफ करते रहे. And this seems to be the way in which the interventions to address poverty and injustice seem to have been addressed in our development strategies. That we have really focused on the symptoms of the problem, which derive from the deep structural injustices of our society. And there has been little attempt to actually create interventions to correct these injustices, so that we work on the assumption that the poor will always be with us. And so we have to then compensate them by in fact, social provisioning through investments in human development up to a point, in social protection programs, in subsidies for the poor. But there is no major agenda for seeing how they can be repositioned within the development process so that they can contribute to, rather than become the incidental beneficiaries of the development process. Here I will conclude basically by saying that if you basically address the critical interventions for the next decade, which may be incorporated into the new MDGs, you should essentially be looking at a more structurally focused set of interventions rather than the astructural, budget-intensive investments which are being made, which I would have hoped that Montek and others who are much more growth and market-oriented would in fact have conceptualized and put into their 5-year plans, rather than seeing inclusion in the plan context as a measure of social provisioning. Now, critical interventions that I would like to see addressed over here are inequitable access to assets. How do you, in fact, give people land or title to land? If you take their land away, how do you, in fact, actually accommodate them within the developmental space? I was reading in today's paper a confrontation going on with regard to the expansion of the POSCO project, presumably in Orissa, and the protests of villagers who would say that what is the use of giving me compensation, it will soon be eaten up. I would have thought that the logical intervention to be made both in Orissa and in the Singur episode would have been to incorporate those whose lands you appropriate into the equity of the company so that they would become permanent stakeholders and beneficiaries in the development process, rather than, in fact, an occasional beneficiary who would then end up sort of working as sort of day laborers in Gurgaon or driving rickshaws in Kolkata. Again, I would look at the whole inequitable participation of the poor or the resource poor in the marketplace. And here again, the sort of interventions I would be looking at would be what has already been put on the table in terms of institutions which have made a creative contribution to human advancement. The role of organizations like Amal, of Seva, of Lijjat in the Indian context. The relevant element of the Amal contribution is that you integrate the primary producers, the small dairy farmers, into a major corporate enterprise which adds value to their product, and to then enable them to share in the value addition process, so that you create an entity which is India's largest agro-processing enterprise, but happens to be owned by 2 to 3 million small dairy farmers. You look at the whole Seva model of collective action by poor women, who through their collectivity then sort of improve their bargaining power in the marketplace. You look at the Lijjat model of aggregating large numbers of household producers into a corporate enterprise which generates the externalities of a larger enterprise, into, in fact, creating small women into competitive participants in the market. You look at the Grameen Bank model, which created a major intervention through provision credit, but the significant contribution of Grameen Bank was that it made its 7 million members into owners of the organization, so that rather than microfinance institutions being a new form of patron-client relationships, however productive they might be, you create one which is owned and accountable to its members, which of course has unfortunately created contestation with the state, which in fact wants to assert its right against the ownership rights of 7 million women today. Again, I will conclude by addressing the issue of inequitable human development, that you have realized MDG goals of 100% primary education, you are improving days in schooling, but what is happening is a huge inequity within the educational systems, where you have privately educated elites and malfunctioning but proliferating public educational institutions. So that knowledge is now becoming one of the greatest sources of widening income and social disparities, and you are going to now have a privately educated ruling class which will be reproducing itself, and you have the mass of the people. If you in fact look at the real East Asian transformation, it lay in the fact that it had a much more integrated schooling system, where in fact most of the education was provided through public education, and this enabled all schools to be raised. I was again looking at some of the numbers in the quality of education indicators of competencies in education. And who is at the top of that list in the table? It is China, which in fact is ahead of Finland. It is Korea, it is Hong Kong, it is Singapore. But far below in these lists happen to be sort of South Asia, and the inequitable dimensions of it, in fact, further aggravate this. So by all means, let us pat ourselves on the back for our success stories in 100% enrollment in primary education, but then let us ponder on the state of our primary schools which are serving the poor. Finally, of course, there are issues of governance. We all claim to be democracies, India perhaps more legitimately than other countries in its neighborhood. But at the end of the day, what we have is undemocratic democracies where our democratic and elective institutions have been captured by people who have the money to finance their interventions in politics and to reproduce themselves, so that you use power as an instrument for then perpetuating your social interests and your capture of the state.
Much broader than the Human Development Report, and there are many other aspects. Now, clearly this is a huge agenda. I'm going to just touch it in broad brush ways. And let's just take the first, see it? I just try to expand it, but it takes some of the indices in the Human Development Report, and as you can see that there's much work to be done, because India, compared to other countries actually in South Asia or even the important BRIC countries, at least two of them, does not perform that well. It has the highest inequality index in South Asia, as well as if you compare it with Brazil and China. So those of you who can't actually see it, India has an inequality, gender inequality index is 132, compared to, let's say, China, which is 35, or Brazil, which is 85. And I do want you to actually look a little bit now and again at Sri Lanka. And now, adolescent fertility, again, you find that we have it the highest in South Asia, and in secondary schools we do worse than almost all other countries except. Now, India has improved. Next. Let's just look at it. India has improved. So if you see from 2004 to 6 to 2007 and 9, the maternal mortality ratio has improved. It has declined from 254 to 212, and then the latest figure we have in the HDR, which is 200. But if you see some of the states I picked, and I picked them for a reason, you see it's enormous inequality within the country. You find that it's as high as Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan. Those are really at the top end of very high levels of maternal mortality ratios. But interestingly, if you take Punjab and Haryana, does prosperity help, overall prosperity? It seems it doesn't filter down, because if you see Punjab and Haryana, which are prosperous states, they still do rather badly, 153, 172. And interestingly, and I think Kerala, which is always held up as this prime example of very good human development indicators, doesn't do particularly well. It gets 81, compared to, as I had pointed out, if you look at the figure for Sri Lanka, which was 35, or for China, which is 37. So here we have a state which has almost 100% literacy. You've had a state which has had a long matrilineal tradition, etc., etc. And yet, why is Kerala doing so badly? Now, I'm not going to necessarily provide an answer, but clearly within Kerala, at every layer of inequality within Kerala, there must be serious pockets where you have high levels of MMR. For instance, there are tribal communities in Kerala. Is that the cause? Is there something else which is happening? I think we need to think about that. Next. So even if we pose this question, why is MMR so high in India? Why is it so high in certain states compared to others? And I think the answer is actually quite complex. because you have the highest proportion of maternal mortality rates in the age group 20 to 24. It isn't as one might expect in lower age groups where you have very early marriage. Early marriage may be a cause, but it is in that age group. And anemia is hugely an important factor. 58% of pregnant women are anemic, and it is increasing. Now, this is an important point, that anemia is increasing from, if you take the NFHS data, over a period of time. So, for instance, in 1998, 50% of pregnant women were anemic. In 2005-06, it's increased to 58%. So, what is happening here? We're actually getting a situation which is worsening, not even staying stable. And we account for 80% of South Asia's pregnant women, anemic pregnant women. So that's a huge number, 20% of maternal deaths, directly and otherwise. Now, we can talk about food supplements, but I think it's something much more complex than simply giving iron tablets, to women who you can reach, because there are a whole range of other things. There are social norms, feeding practices, there are remote locations which are poor care. Of course, there's poverty and marginality. But I also want to focus on something which is not talked about, which is domestic violence against pregnant women. Can we just quickly see the next slide, and then I'll come back to this one. Now, this is a study which a colleague and I did, and it's in Kerala, mind you. And if you see this, okay, it's a small sample, but it's very high levels of physical violence against pregnant women. 38% of the sample reported very high levels of physical violence. How do we deal with that? That's not simply a question of supplements at all. And what is interesting, I don't have the slide here, is that if women have assets within the same sample, if they have land and house, the physical violence, not just for pregnant women, overall drops to 7% incidence. So this is a story I want to come back to. But going back to the previous slide, there is something also very curious happening, and I want to mention it to Montek since he's here, is that you have very different incentives for women to go to for assisted births. So, for instance, a study done in Delhi slums finds that 2 months before the women are expected to give birth, they look at the incentives. If they are from Uttarakhand, they go back to Uttarakhand, because Delhi gives 600 rupees and Uttarakhand gives 1400 or something like that, 14 to 1600. So people do respond to incentives, but if you have very differential incentives across the country, and migrant populations who are among the most vulnerable then tend to return back, then some of the advantages that you might have may actually be lost. So there's a clear case for making these incentives uniformly high. I mean, no reason to reduce it in Uttarakhand or Rajasthan, but actually raise it in Delhi, for an example. Okay, can I, the next slide. The story on education, Rahman has already talked a bit about it, but I think what is alarming about education is that it's worsening. So here we talk about enrollment ratios, and the infrastructure really looks like it's improving. 96% enrollment in the 6 to 14 age group, 73% of schools have drinking water, 57% have usable toilets, a larger number have unusable toilets, they have toilets. But what about learning? And here we find that this is a story we all know from the newspapers, from Pratham's reports and so on, but here it is, it's worsening. So in 2010, 46% of the students in class 5 could not read standard 2 texts. In 2012, 53% cannot do that. So what is happening? I mean, we really do need to focus on this. People say, well, you don't take any tests anymore. I'm not sure that liberalization of many states have disagreed that if upper middle class children in Delhi find it rather difficult to take their rucksacks and there are too many books, I agree with that. But at the same time, there has to be something that we need to look at in terms of quality of education. So this is, in very broad sweep, some of the things that the report does, and if you clean out those glasses, what you're going to see. what does the report not take into account? And I think there are two things that I want to talk about. There's a third thing also, the three things really. One is that we do need to bring in local government. You know, the situation is really imbalanced if you only look at women in parliament. There is no evidence to suggest, there is rather little evidence to suggest that women in parliament are necessarily taking up issues which reduce gender inequality. And there is much evidence that in itself bringing in 1/3 and more women, because many states have now moved to 40 to 50%, could make a huge difference and is making a difference, as with each election and the local panchayats. So I'm not clear why we do not bring this into account, and I would think that serious consideration. South Asia in general would look much, much, much better with this. And as a joke, one might say that we could tell the government, if you just reserved 1/3 women seats for women in parliament, your next HDI would certainly look much better, just by that one stroke.
Why not?
The second thing is that I don't think labor force participation is really a good indicator. Could we go back to the first slide? Is really a good indicator of women's autonomy or empowerment or anything. It doesn't tell you whether women are doing invisible work, unpaid work, etc. And South Asia in general, even if you take Sri Lanka, it would do rather poorly on labor force participation rates. That's because it doesn't get captured. There's so much of informal work everywhere. So it seems to me we do need to move towards better indicators of economic empowerment. And we really should try and see if assets, some measure of assets can be introduced. I know it's a big challenge, there is very little data, but the OECD countries, the OECD database has tried to do that. For instance, they've simply looked at inequalities in inheritance laws in different countries, for a start. Now, India would look rather good in that because we've amended our inheritance laws by and large for the bulk of the population. The 2005 Hindu Succession Act, which makes it gender equal. There's the Parsis and the Christians. I mean, so much of the Indian population is gender equal on that. Much to be done on implementation and actual assets. So there's a big gap between laws and actual assets. About 12.8% of operational holdings are managed by women only. So that's the agricultural census. But then we need to start moving in that direction. Now, I know the HDR was trying to incorporate that at one point, I think a year or two ago. Because that would give you a much better idea of what is happening in terms of women's empowerment. And the next, yeah. Now, I think there are several aspects of freedoms, because that is the sort of underlying notion, the conceptual notion of capabilities and human development. And I've just put down some of them, 6 of them. The first 3 relate to physical security. Security within the home, which are issues of domestic violence, which, as I said, have major health issues. By the way, the WHO had brought out a huge report a few years ago showing how domestic violence affects health. And, of course, it affects every other major capability. Your ability to work outside the home, your ability to participate in public life, your ability to sit in panchayats, if you like. It affects all the human capabilities. So much as physical violence, freedom from physical violence in the home, in the streets, and in the workplace. Now, there's been much news on that and certain kinds of news, but I think a huge amount of work needs to be done there and link it to the possibility of improving or reducing gender inequality. These are the subtle norms which are not easy to measure, but need to be much talked about. And then the economic security, which, as I've said, you do need to talk about productive assets and secure employment. One might broaden it and say secure livelihoods. Now that, again, goes back to the link between assets and livelihoods for the bulk of the South Asian population, which is rural, still largely rural. There's a feminization of agriculture. So your food security, your home food security, your country's food security could increasingly depend on that. And so I think the issues of economic security are extremely important. And then freedom from repressive social norms. And again, I think we need to think about this. It was very interesting that in Bangladesh, which has a very high level of female labor participation rates, and 57%, I was really, it's very interesting. And how in the early years, in the 80s and mid-80s, some of the studies that were done with BRAC, and there were interviews with women, and how they challenged social norms, because going out to work in the context of poverty was so important, not just for them, but for their families. And their families then supported them, and they challenged the conservative social norms. So I think there's a link between the kinds of policies we introduce and empowering people to actually challenge social norms, which as economists we tend to say, well, it's all given, but of course we know social norms can and need to be challenged. And then this is my final point. The last slide is something you all recognize, that what is development is the freedom to choose what we have reason to value. I think we tend to gloss over the reason to value part of this and take it, okay, this is a nice way that Amartya Sen said it. The reason to value has double edges to it, because it has an edge that people might or might not, or families might or might not have reason to value that you have good nutrition or good education for girls. Women themselves may or may not, given their multiple and complex choices, be able to choose those. And there could be a big gap between what different elements of the population, both local and policymakers, may have on what they have reason to value and what people who are actually effective have reason to value. So I think this issue of reason to value needs to be taken in all its complexity and see where are the conflicts and where is the convergence in this, and how can we actually bring about convergence of values with reason. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Agarwal, for giving us a look, for reviewing the HDR report through a gendered lens, for focusing on India and its neighbors, and for then comparing the data within states of the Indian Union, and particularly for the 6 issues that you raised of gender inequalities in the Human Development Report. I think it was particularly important, the point in which you concluded about the question of freedom to choose what we have reason to value, and showing how the complexity contained within that idea needs to be unpacked so that we can have a convergence. Thank you very much. Now may I invite Mr. Montek Ahluwalia, Deputy Chairman of the Planning Commission, who has actually been a very important policy maker in India for several years, and several positions he has held in the government of India from late 1970s, in various ministries. He has been a key figure in India's economic reforms. But most of all, I think he has, in many ways, played an important role in changing the nature of our public debate on the transformation process. He has received several honorary degrees, an honorary doctorate in civil laws from the University of Oxford. And now I think there are several important issues that have come up in the discussion, and we look forward to your both looking at the report and responding to them.
I go there.
Yeah.
Ajay, Peter, Rahman, Bina, and friends, it's a great pleasure to be here. I always find, I think I've been associated with launches of the HDI report in many years, and one of the reasons I do that is, of course, a sort of an affectionate nostalgia. Rahman mentioned the name of Mahbubul Haq. I was never actually involved with the early work done in UNDP for the HDI, but I was a witness to how it all began, which is essentially Mahbub chucking up the World Bank because he felt it was impossible to reform from inside. I remember in the 70s, the World Bank began to talk about poverty. And within the bank's context, the removal of poverty moved over time to become a more and more important objective. And I think Mahbub's point was that this is a unidimensional kind of conceptualization. And he was always within the bank arguing that, you know, it's not very useful to talk about poverty. It's much better to talk about meeting basic needs. I mean, the essence of meeting basic needs is the assumption that whatever these needs are, they're multidimensional. They're not $1 a day or $2 a day and everything else will be taken care of. And that you needed a policy that would somehow ensure that these basic needs would be met. That didn't mean, by the way, that the state would deliver each of these basic needs, but that you would be running the economy in a way in which the basic needs would be met. Many of them would be met through rising income, but many of them would have to be met through very specific state policy. And I think when Ajay, in his presentation, talked about the proactive role of the state, I mean, everybody believes in a proactive role. I'm not aware of anyone who thinks that the best thing to do is to destroy the state completely, so that you are left completely to the market. Even the most right-wing conservative will define some role for the state. They probably won't call it proactive. They'll tend to call it regulatory and sort of rule maintenance. I think proactive, quite rightly, goes well beyond that. It means that you actively have to do a lot of things quite apart from what gets done in the market. And I think most developing countries have always taken that view. So the proactive role of the state was very much in Mahbub's mind when he wanted to move away from just poverty to basic needs. Then, of course, he left and worked on these ideas in UNDP, and it emerged with the Human Development Report, which I think the first one was 1980 or thereabouts? 1990. 1990, okay. So I was kind of familiar with his thinking on these processes, and we have numbers for 1980 HDI, but the report was actually in 1990. You know, you have to judge an idea by whether it sort of takes off. But I also think you have to judge an idea by how many other ideas it kicks off. So in a sense, a really good idea has within it the seeds of its own obsolescence. And I think judged by both those criteria, the HDI is an extremely good idea. It's a good idea because I think the world wanted to get away from a sort of one-dimensional measure, GDP. Actually, GDP is not one-dimensional. GDP is multi-dimensional, but aggregated through prices, and the prices are determined by the market. But you know, people felt GDP is not really what we are about. It's a little. It is true that in the 60s, in the 50s, 60s, the early plans, all of them focused really on the idea of GDP. But then, you know, conceptually, people wanted the development of their country. And I don't think that people's description of development would just be, we want to double the GDP or treble. Underneath that was a whole lot of other things. Now, you know, we know now that I think when Mahbub and the UNDP brought in this three-dimensional measure, if you like, which has GDP with some purchasing power correction, which is quite fair. It has health, which some indicators that seem to me quite reasonable. And then it has education with a couple of indicators thrown in, and you put them all together, and then you can rank countries not on the basis of GDP, but on the basis of HDI. Now, you know, obviously, if everybody's rank is the same, then it's not a very useful idea. And I think by that criterion, it's an extremely useful idea. Because it's obvious to in each country that you may have X rank on per capita income, but you have either a higher rank or a lower rank on HDI, which basically means that if you think health and education are important, and I have no doubt that people think health and education are important, then surely, you know, the ranking by per capita GDP isn't really the same thing, isn't all. Of course, you know, all of this is related to material measures. Mind you, our small neighbor to the north, Bhutan, has departed from this completely and gone into a much more conceptual concept of gross national happiness. This, of course, raises many interesting issues, and I think while I was looking through the report, there are reports here of perceptional sense of goodwill, sense of wellness, if you like. And that becomes very interesting because, you know, an incredibly large number of Indians are reported to be quite satisfied with their condition, notwithstanding low per capita income, low HDI, and so on. So it's really quite tough to work out how do people really think. Having said that, there's a great need for measurement, because I think good measurement then leads people to ask, first of all, have things actually improved or not based on a good measurement? And secondly, what are you going to do about it? And ultimately, for a so-called policy maker or social scientist or a planner or whatever, it's really what you can do about it that matters. I mean, quite frankly, if there's nothing that one can do about something that matters, then I think religion is the only thing to resort to. And I'm assuming that the whole purpose of this activity is the belief, and that's what a proactive state is supposed to do, is the belief that we can do something about it. Now, what are the issues? I think 2 or 3 things have happened. First, those who used to worry about GDP, I mean, they always knew that GDP excluded externalities. But somehow one tucked it away in the background. I mean, conceptually, that's not new. That's as old as welfare economics. But it was always there, but slightly neglected. The second one is excludes, you know, the phenomenon that a lot of GDP may not actually be sustainable production. I mean, you may just be depleting your stock of natural resources. Now, I mean, the most extreme case is a country I won't mention, a small island country which is actually made largely of phosphate in a way, because it's guano droppings that created the huge island. And the major export is actually just the earth over there, which yields a certain GDP, but it also diminishes the island all the time. So it's a kind of self-destructive form of GDP, which, I mean, it only makes sense if you utilize the GDP to create some other permanent income-earning asset so that actually the country can truly enjoy a sustainable level of living. That's an extreme example. But, you know, all of us are utilizing natural resources, and the question arises, how do you measure GDP if you're simply utilizing a fixed resource? I think we have set up, in the Planning Commission, we set up a group under Partha Dasgupta to do green accounting. And I think they recently submitted their report. They produced basically a framework of how do you go about it. And it's sort of interesting, because their framework really is that, you know, you have reproducible capital, you have natural capital, and you have human capital. And in some ways, I mean, there must be a way of utilizing natural capital which doesn't deplete it, but there are some kinds of natural capital which will get depleted. There's only this much of aluminum or bauxite, and only this much of iron ore, and this much of coal, and this much of fossil fuels in the world. So there is a depletion. But I think their concept is that, you know, if the total capital stock, which includes the human capital and the reproducible capital, and takes account of the depletion of natural capital, is not lower at the start of the period than at the beginning of the period, then whatever you produced during that period is actually a sustainable GDP. I would go further and say that, you know, what this misses out is the concept of the stock of knowledge. And the stock of knowledge is not the same thing as a stock of human capital. Because you can have a lot of scientists and, you know, they're able to do a lot of things, but some of them at some point will actually make a leap in technology, and say a leap in technology that enables you to use solar power at 1/3 the current price will make it unnecessary to use fossil fuels. But that leap in technology has to come, and that's not the same thing as human capital. You could have a lot of human capital, but there's a randomness of what economists used to call manna from heaven, technology which comes in and which solves the problem. So we've been aware of the fact that GDP is a gross simplification, but we never actually built it in. And I think what the Human Development Index did was it popularized a new index which made people think in 2 or 3 dimensions, health and education. But actually, the moment you start thinking in those dimensions, you immediately realize that there are a large number of others. Now, I mean, Rahman mentioned inequality of access to inequality in general, inequality of access to assets. Bina talked about gender inequality. So those, you can just add those in. And I think that's what we've done in the Planning Commission. We now have, for the 12th plan, 25 monitorable indicators. You know, planners are usually derided as being what is called growth wallas. You only care about target growth rate. So we have explicitly said that the plan, in terms of things you value, does not have one target. It has 25 targets. And some of them, obviously one of them is GDP growth. But another target, which we think is very important from the inclusiveness angle, is a target growth rate for agriculture. Because given our current structure of the society and the structure of the economy, we believe that a GDP growth rate of 8%, which is achieved with a 4% agricultural growth, will be distributionally much better than a GDP growth of 8%, which is achieved entirely by huge increase in mining and not much going on in agriculture. So there is a multidimensionality there that is built into the system. I won't repeat all the 25 monitorable indicators, but the fact is things like progress in education, progress in maternal mortality rates, progress in infant mortality rate, green forest cover, number of jobs created in the organized sector, and so on. Why have we put this down? Now, one interesting point is that whereas GDP numbers are churned out relentlessly, irrespective of short-term errors that invariably creep in by the Central Statistical Office, these other data are not churned out in a similar way, in a mechanical manner. But they do become available as a result of surveys. So there's a great lag. Having accepted that, the idea is that as and when somebody wants to judge, has the 12th plan achieved its objectives, it won't be enough to say, yes, it did because the economy grew at 8%. I'm not actually predicting that it will. That's actually very tough. But I'm saying that's our target as an average. It won't be enough to say we grew at 8%. I think it would be quite legitimate to say, well, that's fine. That's targets. What about the others? And then we would have to do an accounting of the others. And, you know, my guess would be that you never achieve any target 100%. But I think if on 80% of those indicators we achieve 80% of the target, or let's say 90% of the target, that would be pretty good performance. It forces the debate into an area where judgments are not unidimensional. And you know, even there, it cannot be said that we've taken care of all the problems. I mean, let's take equality, for example. For a long time in the development literature, particularly the development literature produced by the international development banks, inequality was downplayed and poverty was given the primary focus. There's a very good reason for that, and that is basically the global willingness to fund development assistance was greatest if you could link assistance that the assistant goes to the poorest of the poor. So many people who would not really, let's say in a richer country, and I don't blame them for this, even in happier times, and people could say, look, why on earth should I be giving aid to whatever, China, India, these are countries that have all kinds of other objectives, etc. And then the answer was, well, look, there's a lot of poor people. And, you know, wherever they are, whatever you think of their governments, if they're living on less than $1 a day, there's a kind of a global desire to help. Now, the focus on poverty was therefore derived from what would most legitimize the demand for funding. But that, I've often said, even in the World Bank, that that does not make any sense at all in a political context. Nobody can, in a democracy, nobody can go before the public and say that my objective is to focus only on the poor. Because actually, in a political context, identities are multiple. And there's very strong push that we should do something on equality which is quite independent of reducing poverty. Let me give you a few examples. First question, interregional differences. Now, it's quite possible to have a situation where poverty is actually going down, but interregional differences are widening. That would not be very easy to sell politically. So immediately everyone would say, there's no question that poverty reduction is important, but we must have a narrowing of interregional differences also. Intercaste differences. I mean, this can be actually quite distinct from poverty reduction, because we are a socially fragmented society, historically so. So it would be quite logical for a particular group to say that, look, true equality means that the mean income of every group should be more or less similar. We know it's not. Scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, OBCs, minorities, and the general population, mean incomes differ quite a lot. Now, you know, it's actually possible to have a situation where poverty as a whole is going down, but the mean income differential is actually increasing. It's also possible to have a situation where the mean income differential is narrowing, but actually poverty is increasing. So again, the answer is, no, we want a reduction in poverty, we also want a reduction in mean incomes. And the gender issue is just one overlay on exactly that kind of categorization. So I think what is happening is that the objectives, the developmental objectives that a proactive state has to follow have to be more multidimensional than is captured in the HDI alone. This is not to be interpreted as a critique of the HDI. It is actually to be interpreted as showing that the moment you question an idea, many more questions arise. And I mean, we are after all, Amartya Sen's called us the argumentative Indians. So it would not be consistent with our national character if the moment an index is produced, we don't produce at least 4 or 5 other indices. Not that those indices are better, but that if you think the first index is important, you can't say the second and the third and the fourth aren't important. I don't want this to come out as if I'm in any sense denigrating the work of the UNDP. I personally think that, you know, the test of an idea is that it is challenged, it is imitated, it is replicated, and then ultimately people go beyond that idea. So from that point of view, Ajay, as the representative of the organization, the senior most representative of the organization, let me compliment you. I think over these 2 decades, there's no doubt that the UNDP HDI has actually informed public debate. The best way in which you can say that, and this is an interesting story, I was traveling around in the Sundarbans a long time ago. I must confess, dominantly for tourism, but I was doing a little bit of developmental examination also. And the district collector in the area that I was in, as I was leaving for the airport, gave to me the Human Development Index of that district. And there are many states are doing human development indices anyway. They're not the same as the UNDP in terms of the measurement, but they're roughly similar. And within states, districts are doing human development indicators. So I think that's as a scholar, the only thing one wants is to be read and emulated, and then hopefully have people go beyond that. And I think on those criteria, this particular contribution has been very important. But you know, the interesting thing is that even when we talk about inclusive growth, the integration of the growth side with these other things is very important. For a long time, the HDI used to simply say, well, look, HDI is very important, and this is what you have to do, and some policy implications. This report goes way beyond that, because actually, other than documenting HDI, it's really raising a much broader issue of the rise of the South, most of which is on trade and GDP and so on. And I think that reflects the fact that, you know, in the end, the interesting, it's not easy to identify policies which are not embedded in larger policies, but will somehow promote any particular objective. And of course, this is a global report, so it's talking about the South as a whole. But looking at it from the domestic point of view, there are three pillars that they outline. I think they're quite good, actually, that you need a proactive state. Anybody who thinks that everything will be done by leaving everything to prices in a free market with no state, I mean, that's simply baloney. We've never believed that, but in case somebody believes it, we are happy to endorse the view that you do need a proactive state. I think the second and the very interesting one is the tapping of global markets. This is very much what we've been trying to do. And you know, it's not something that isn't controversial. So translating it into policy can at times become controversial. Everybody wants to tap into everyone else's market, but on the assumption that they won't be allowed to tap into our market. Now you have to start with the assumption that nobody's going to get away with that. You've heard Rahman say that, you know, we haven't, I agree with him, by the way, and it is my personal view that we ought to be a lot more open to neighboring countries. So this is the central thing that I think what the tapping of global markets says is that mechanical prescriptions of just kind of rolling down tariffs, etc., is not really what you want. But you do want to have a sense that development consists of tapping into global markets. I think it would be a good idea to add, and that allows people to tap into your markets also, because the way it stands, it's a non-controversial, a non-difficult problem. But it's implicit that you need to run a policy in which everybody is tapping into the global market, and if you're part of the global market, they're going to tap into your market too. How do you do it in a manner that your tapping is successful? There's huge variation. And I do want to compliment the UNDP report. There are a lot of references there to the literature. Many of the people who have written and using fairly formal methods of analysis, documenting why certain oversimplified ways of posing problems may not be giving you the right answer. So actually quite rich in that, and I think that people who read the report, particularly scholars, will find extremely interesting. The third pillar is the idea of determined social policy innovation. I think this is also very much what we are trying to do. I'm not saying that we are succeeding in doing it, but there's no doubt that in our view, inclusive growth means that the state will have to do major initiatives in certain areas while leaving most other things to the market. Those areas, in my view, are infrastructure and, of course, health and education. Plus, a lot of what I would call livelihood support operations at the lower end of the income spectrum. And these, in the Indian context, these are the four things that we really need to do. And again, there are different ways of doing them, and each of those ways is actually controversial. But I feel that what we need, and this is the principle really on which the 12th plan is based, a very clear recognition, inclusive growth is not just a growth strategy with a bit of bells and whistles of inclusive program added on. It is, first and foremost, it is a strategy that will ensure that the growth is inherently distributionally more benign. And there are many things. Agriculture is only one of them. Regional growth is another. If you really want regional equality in growth, there is no alternative to bringing about regional equality in infrastructure development. It's only when the backward areas of the country get connected that you can expect them to grow at all. And by the way, one of the very positive things that I find in the discussions that I have with the states is a very clear understanding of what needs to be done. The erstwhile backward states, we often compliment them correctly that one of the successes of the 11th plan is the earlier backward states which were growing very slowly are now growing much more rapidly. But what they point out is that, we're growing rapidly faster than the fastest state if we have to catch up, and they're right. So actually, if you were to conceptualize that India's growth is 8% on a target, probably from the point of view of the backward states, convergence would require that the more advanced states will grow at 6% and the backward ones will grow at 10 and 11. Actually, of course, what happens is most of the advanced states think that 8% is because there are a lot of backward states, and they're actually going to grow faster. So, whether the interstate balance is going to come out exactly the way is needed is an open question. But one of the central messages that is relevant here is that there's no way that the backward states are going to grow unless infrastructure is built up. And that has to be the role of a proactive state. How that is done, public sector investment, PPP, huge numbers of controversies on PPP also. It just shows you that it's very easy to agree at a mantra level, but the fun begins when you try to get down a little bit into detail. And I think on education and health, you have very similar problems. And we have actually very substantially increased the expenditure on education. But I think, as Rahman said, it's relatively easy to get a broad spread in terms of enrollments and thereby increase the number of years of schooling. But if the number of years of schooling of the upper half of the population is a lot better, it reflects better quality than the number of years of schooling of the lower half of the population, that's a puzzle. How exactly you solve it, by the way, is not very clear. I mean, one solution, which could be described as an extreme solution, and was, I think, a little implicit in what Rahman said, so I'm giving you an opportunity to clarify your position. One position is abolish private education completely. And by the way, there's a seriously held view that if we were to actually make education an exclusively public thing, then all the top half of the population would spend their considerable energies on actually improving the public schools. But, I mean, is that the solution? I'm not sure that that's viable at all. So the second best thing is, how do you improve the quality of public education? That's not a matter merely of putting money into the system, though that is essential. So bringing about governance improvements that would actually bring about the quality improvement you need is actually very vital. Similar issues will arise in health. Now, I don't want to go on and on. I just want to sort of pose these issues in a framework which basically say we are benefited by the UNDP broadening the concern beyond GDP into a concept of human development, that actually has led to a much further broadening, at least in India, of the concepts that are relevant. And the real challenge is, what's the set of policies that actually lead to these end results? And there, as you get into details, I think it's not a bad idea to be guided by the principles that are outlined in the HDI report. But it would be, for those of you who are scholars, it would be quite useful to draw little tree diagrams to indicate where are the differences. And whichever one you follow, you will come across alternative ways of addressing the same problem, and the policy dispute really is which one's better. I think one message that comes out of the HDI, which I strongly endorse, is that please don't derive the end result from a preconceived formula. The fact is, experience varies. We should learn a lot from other countries, learn from success. And of course, you can't apply it mechanically, but there are some glaring examples where if we were to follow them, we would end up with very different outcomes. I'll conclude with only giving one, which is highly controversial and which is mentioned in the HDI. conditional cash transfers are identified in the HDI as a major inter-country winner. They're extremely controversial in India. Many people that I've talked to are willing to move to cash transfers, providing it can, better targeting, efficiency, etc., are totally opposed to having cash transfers that are conditional. Disagree on many of the other things, and I think if it stimulates a debate on those issues, it would have truly made a signal contribution. So with those words, and once again, congratulations on bringing out this report. Thank you very much. So again, well, it's always a good idea. 2 questions. Way over time, but I know.
Thank you, Mr. Ahluwalia, for not just responding to the report, but also responding to the other presentations at multiple levels. We have time for just a couple of questions because we have been running late. So, are there any pressing questions from the House?
My name is Rukmini Srinivasan.
Sorry,
I'm a journalist.
we have a question here.
My name is Rukmini Srinivasan. I'm a journalist with the Times of India. I think I should just make it one question.
Can you speak into the mic?
Is that better?
Yes. I think that's a lot better.
Okay. So my question is to Dr. Ahluwalia, and partly to do with data and partly with the inclusive development agenda. That since inclusive development has been such a large part of this government's push for the 2 terms that are now coming to an end, do you think that this is where the data lag comes into question, that when expanded social spending is going to be probably a key part of what they see as their success, we haven't had any usable data on health for 8 years now since the National Family Health Survey. So, and even covering the Human Development Report, it's almost futile for Indian journalists to, since the data never changes and hasn't for several years. So, is this a problem, an impediment in selling the inclusive development?
Yes, it is. First of all, I'm glad that you mentioned this because the National Family Health Survey is technically not an official system, though it's officially blessed and so on. And for some reason, they have periodicity. Part of that is simply a reflection of the fact that they never thought that people would really regard this as sufficiently important. Now they do. And I don't know when the next National Family Health Survey is supposed to come out, but it's probably supposed to be done this year and therefore won't be available until next year. However, the government recognizing that if child malnutrition is important, which it clearly is, we need to have reliable data on a much more regular basis. My understanding is that the annual health survey, which is being done district by district in the ministry, will now capture this data. And I think the proposal is that every year 1/3 of the districts will get covered. So you'll get a kind of a rolling measure of what's happening with each part of the country covered every 3rd year. Okay? I have been saying very strongly that we should not discontinue the National Family Health Survey, at least the next one, because it's possible that if the National Family Health Survey feel that this new survey is actually pretty good, they may not want to do it. But they should do the next one because we need the benchmark. I mean, otherwise we'll have 2 sets of data which don't relate to each other at all. Technically, malnutrition is measured by the Anganwadis. Now, the Anganwadis are supposed to, they have weighing machines and they're supposed to compute growth charts, and they do classify children according to severely malnourished, and something else, normal and so on. The problem is there is a lot of skepticism about the quality of that data. But technically the data is there, and whenever I discuss this with state governments, that data shows much better results than the National Family Health Survey. Now, whether that is a reflection of the effectiveness of these programs, which after all were speeded up really only in the 11th plan, which began in 2007, 2008, or simply that it's not good quality data, is impossible to tell. But I think when we get the district, there was a group of people which produced this Hangama report, hunger and malnutrition converted into Hangama, and I think Abhijit Banerjee did an analysis of, and that was a pretty good sample, not a universal one, but for certain districts. And I think it was Abhijit Banerjee who, in that report, has done some sort of an analysis. What does this show compared to 2005, 2006? And my recollection is that it does show that malnutrition is also coming down, and maybe coming down faster than it was earlier. But, you know, it's highly qualified, and we have to really wait for this data to come out.
Can we have the last question, David?
My name is Devaki Jain, and I'm very glad that Ajay mentioned the earlier South Commission. I was a member of that South Commission, which Julius Nyerere headed. And I noticed that one of the proposals that have come out is to set up a new South Commission. I wanted to propose to you, and maybe even to Montek and others, that it's very valuable to look at that old report. Remember, it was drafted by no less a person than Dr. Manmohan Singh. And as you see BRICS coming up now, you will notice that we had already mentioned the South Bank in our recommendation. And we had actually given it the same framework and objectives that BRICS has got, that is development and financing. But we had taken note of, in some sense, what Rahman said, a slightly more equity building across the continents. It was not just those who are running fast will run fast. So I wanted to suggest that before you set up the new South Commission, it would be quite useful to have some look at the old report, because apart from the South Bank, there's also all kinds of ideas for commodity banks, ways in which you can even out resource disparities between the continents. And therefore, I thought if your center here, as well as the one in New York, could start looking at that report and look at some of the suggestions that come out of it as you go forward and make it much more widely known, you might find that your partners will be getting many ideas for the ways in which the South can rise as a South. Thank you.
To address you.
Well, there wasn't a question really, but thank you so much, Devaki. That's very good, and we certainly will. I mean, we're not going to set up a new South Commission as such. I mean, that's really an open question, but it is a suggestion, of course, by us to revamp it, but certainly, yeah, some of the ideas are there. Some of them are being taken up, and in fact, I do think that I mean, Montek can correct me, but the BRICS Bank idea is a start, and I'm sure it's going to evolve further and expand further, and the kind of things that Rahman is talking about in terms of its objective to bring the rest of the South with it, so that you don't have a dual-track South, will obviously play an important role going forward. I mean, so we shouldn't judge the BRICS Bank just by the fact of what has currently been set up. I'm sure this is going to evolve quite considerably in the future as well. So thank you very much, and we'll certainly look at it and push it. And one thing I want to say is that, thank you so much for your comments, Montek, because I think the purpose of this center that we have established in Delhi, the Global International IC4HD, is really not to come up with new indicators, but to really see how to look at, the kind of policies that will lead to improvements in the human development, more broadly defined than just what is in the index itself. So it's very much in that direction. Of course, the Secretary General has now appointed this new commission, chaired by David Cameron, President Yudhoyono, and Ellen Sirleaf Johnson, to look at the post-2015 agenda, and which issues of inequality, sustainability, etc. will play a very, very important role. We're now about to see that report coming out soon, in the next few months. But some of the things that are mentioned here as the challenges to human development will certainly feature very, very prominently in that as well. Thank you.
I have the pleasure now of thanking all of you for being here. As Mr. Chibar just said, the new International Center for Human Development joins with the HDRO in New York to take forward this public discussion on human development, to take it forward in at least 4 different ways, to look at the wealth of data that has been created and, in a sense, expand the interpretative space, to try and develop the framework of analysis that has been evolving, to develop the comparative picture that both in terms of sub-region, region, and the larger global picture, and to engage with the complex conceptual landscape. I think the 4 presentations that we've had today raised issues, both philosophical and conceptual. I mean, not just in terms of, for example, complex questions of value, but the complexity of judgment itself. Raised questions of policy challenges, which were interregional, policy challenges such that one could make distribution more benign, raised complex questions of method and issues of measurement, and I think very interestingly also invited us to look at the political questions of this exercise of making sure that human development reaches right across the spectrum of groups, geographical regions, larger political regions, etc. I'm really grateful to our 4 panelists for joining with us today in launching the regional report. I thank the excellencies who joined us today for this presentation, the Government of India officials, the team from the United Nations larger family and UNDP in particular, to members of the press who have been with us, to the small team from the new center, the IC4HD, and the Indian Institute of Advanced Study. This new center, we hope, will emerge as an important institutional space for us to examine these questions, not just in terms of the immediate interpretation of the data, but also engaging with some of the more conceptual issues that emerge. And for that, the new center has actually already developed a set of initiatives. We are offering fellowships for scholars and policymakers from the Global South. We've planned a series of workshops where policymakers can come and begin to engage with some of these questions. We're going to have schools and study weeks. I think the little brochure that was given to all of you indicates the 4 dimensions that we will be following.